Why did the room fall silent the moment she stepped through the gate? Rain pressed down on the base like a held breath. Midnight had already passed, the kind of hour when only the necessary remained awake. Commander Luke Herron didn't expect surprises anymore. 15 years inside special operations trained him to recognize patterns. Predictability meant safety. So when Gate 7 lit up with an alert, something inside him tightened. She stood there without resistance. No ID, no paperwork, no explanation that fit the rules. Civilian clothes soaked through, hair darkened by rain, posture calm without effort. She didn't look lost. She looked finished waiting. The guard couldn't explain it later, only that when he asked her to step back, his body did the opposite. Not fear, not threat, just an instinct older than training. Herron felt it too the second their eyes met. The look wasn't defiant. It wasn't pleading. It was the look of someone who understood consequences and had already accepted them. "I need to speak to the Admiral," she said quietly. That was when the air changed. Operation Nightfall wasn't a name you said aloud. It didn't exist. It had erased people. When she spoke it, Herron felt the ground shift beneath everything he thought he understood about rank, clearance, and control. As they walked, it happened again. Marines stopped mid-stride. SEALs straightened without thinking. No salutes, no formalities, just respect, instinctive, unspoken, earned somewhere no records could reach. By the time they reached the Admiral's office, Herron already knew the truth would be heavier than the mystery. And when the Admiral stood up for her, something he had never done for anyone, Herron realized this woman wasn't asking for permission. She was reporting in. Something she hadn't told them yet sat beneath her calm, something vast and dangerous and already moving. But she wasn't here to explain the past. She was here because the future was running out of time. What kind of person gives up their name before giving up their mission? Inside the secure conference room, the silence pressed close, the kind that listens back. She sat without fidgeting, hands still, eyes present, not tense, focused. When the Admiral opened the file, Herron felt something inside him recoil, not from the images he'd seen worse, but from what wasn't there. No service number, no rank, no origin, just impact. Cities, conflicts, operations that officially resolved themselves without explanation. She spoke when asked, never elaborated, never softened the truth. 8 months embedded, no contact, no extraction plan, no return identity. When Herron saw the photograph, recognition hit like a delayed echo. The woman in the marketplace, different face, same awareness, same stillness. Children had lived because she disappeared. And she did it again and again. Each time she erased more of herself. No medals, no family, no one to call when it ended. The respect she commanded wasn't awe, it was acknowledgement, from people who knew exactly what that kind of sacrifice cost. When the new threats surfaced, domestic, coordinated, hidden in ordinary materials, Herron felt the fear he hadn't felt since his first deployment. This wasn't a battlefield, it was everyday life. And she was the only way in. She volunteered without drama, without pride, just fact. Going back meant torture if discovered, compromise of everything she'd ever protected. But the choice didn't weigh on her the way it did on the men around the table. Because she had already crossed that line years ago. She just hadn't told anyone how lonely it was on the other side. How do you prepare to become someone who shouldn't survive? The transformation unsettled Herron more than any mission prep ever had. It wasn't the prosthetics, it was the way her posture shifted before the mirror, how her breathing changed, how her eyes learned to belong to someone else. She didn't mourn the loss of herself this time. That scared him. As the sun set, she studied faces that might end her life, memorized habits, weaknesses, beliefs. No backup, no rescue fantasy. Just precision and patience. On the drive, Herron wanted to ask her what kept her going, what she missed, but he understood some questions weren't meant to be spoken. Inside the warehouse, time stretched thin, conversations layered with tests, loyalty measured in silence and shared guilt. She passed them all. And as plans were spoken, schools, transit hubs, crowded places, Harren felt something break inside him. Not fear, rage. She transmitted calmly, gave them everything. Then the questions sharpened. Doubt crept in. Her voice never wavered. But Harren heard something beneath it, acceptance. She knew the math. She finished anyway. What does courage sound like when no one will hear it? When suspicion turned physical, Harren tasted helplessness for the first time in years. Orders meant nothing now. Timing was everything. Her final transmission wasn't dramatic. It was complete. Then silence. Teams moved across the country in perfect synchronization. Attacks stopped before they began. Lives preserved without headlines. Inside the warehouse, chaos ended quickly. When they found her, alive but diminished, Harren looked away. Not out of weakness. Out of respect. She had held the line longer than anyone should have to. What happens after the world keeps spinning? Because you stopped it from breaking. Recovery didn't restore what she lost. There was no ceremony big enough. No public gratitude. Just quiet rooms and honest nods. She struggled with daylight, with being seen, with existing without a cover. But slowly pieces returned. Not the past. Something new. And every time someone in uniform stood straighter near her, she understood she was not invisible. Just unrecorded. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And then it disappears back into the crowd, leaving the world safer, quieter, and unaware of how close it came to breaking. What kind of person gives up their name before giving up their mission? The door closed behind them with a soft seal, the kind meant to keep secrets from ever leaking out. No windows, no clocks, just polished wood, muted lights, and a table that had carried decisions heavier than most lives could comprehend. She chose a chair midway down, not at the head, not at the edge. It wasn't humility. It was habit. The posture of someone who understood power didn't always announce itself. Commander Harren sat across from her, still trying to reconcile the image in his mind. Civilian clothes, no identification. Yet an entire base had reacted to her as if a silent command had been issued the moment she arrived. He had spent his career learning how respect was earned. Deployments, scars, promotions, names etched into records. None of that applied here. The Admiral entered carrying a file thicker than most operational briefings. Its cover bore markings Harren had only seen a handful of times in his career. Levels beyond clearance, beyond curiosity, beyond comfort. When the file opened, there was no biography, no origin story, just consequences. Images appeared first. Places Harren recognized immediately, conflict zones he had either operated in himself or followed through fragmented intelligence reports. Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Eastern Europe, but the timestamps were wrong. These photos were taken before things collapsed, before attacks, before headlines. This was prevented, the Admiral said quietly, not responded to. Harren leaned in. His chest tightened. He wasn't looking at missions. He was looking at absences, events that never happened because someone had already stepped into the dark and dismantled them from the inside. The woman, Alina, she had said her name was, remained still. Her face didn't change as the images passed. There was no pride there, no relief, just recognition, like revisiting places she had left pieces of herself behind. When the Admiral finally spoke her name, it wasn't an introduction. It was acknowledgement. Alina, he said, tell him about Kandahar. For a moment, something flickered in her eyes. Not fear, memory, the kind that lives in the body more than the mind. Her shoulders settled, spine aligning as if she had stepped back into an old rhythm. Kandahar wasn't supposed to work, she said calmly. The cell was sealed, no external contact, no leverage, they trusted no one. Heron noticed how she spoke, precise, economical, no emotional language, the way operators spoke when emotion had already been paid in full. It required someone who didn't exist, she continued. No records, no family, no traceable past, someone who could disappear without raising questions. The Admiral slid a photograph across the table. A woman stood in a crowded marketplace, partially veiled, posture alert but unremarkable. To an untrained eye, she blended perfectly. To Heron, something about the angle of her shoulders, the way her weight rested slightly forward, struck a nerve. That intelligence prevented coordinated attacks on 3 American schools, the Admiral said. Over 400 children. The number landed like a physical blow. Heron looked from the photograph to the woman sitting across from him. The resemblance was undeniable now, altered, disguised, but unmistakable. You lived inside them, Heron said quietly. She nodded once. 8 months, she replied. Every day required a different version of myself. Trust was earned through shared risk, shared violence, shared silence. There it was, the unspoken cost. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. Heron had led men who carried that same quiet weight, memories they never voiced because words would cheapen them. But when it ended, Heron said, choosing his words carefully, you couldn't come back. No, she replied simply. There was nothing to come back to. The Admiral closed the photograph and opened another section of the file. Maps replaced images. This time they were closer to home, American cities, red markers, patterns. The room felt smaller. What she uncovered overseas, the Admiral said, was only a fragment. The network adapted. It learned. It came here. Alina leaned forward now, forearms resting on the table. The movement was subtle, but the shift in energy was immediate. This wasn't reflection. This was urgency. They're not moving weapons across borders anymore, she said. They don't need to. They're using what's already here. Fertilizer, vehicles, industrial chemicals, things that don't raise alarms until it's too late. Heron felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen this evolution before. Adversaries always learned faster than systems did. Our sources indicate a final coordination meeting, she continued, tomorrow night. She slid a blueprint forward. A warehouse complex outside San Diego, isolated, ordinary, invisible. Heron studied it instinctively, marking access points, choke zones, blind spots. His mind ran ahead, assembling teams, imagining angles. Then he stopped himself. They wouldn't be sending teams in first. He looked up slowly. You're the access, he said. She met his gaze without hesitation. The only one, she replied. The Admiral's silence confirmed it. Heron exhaled through his nose, a controlled release of tension. What's the support structure? Minimal, she said. What's the extraction plan? There isn't one. The words didn't echo, they sank. Heron leaned back, crossing his arms, trying to keep his voice steady. That's not a plan, that's a gamble. Alina tilted her head slightly, not defensive, curious. Every plan is a gamble, she said. This one just admits it. There was no bravado in her voice, no fatalism, just clarity. She explained how the identity she had built overseas hadn't ended. It had grown. Trust accumulated over years. Reputations formed in places where survival was currency. But using it again, she said, means going deeper than before. If I'm exposed, it won't end quickly, and it won't end cleanly. Heron imagined what that meant and stopped himself. He had learned long ago that imagining too much could break focus. The Admiral spoke then, his voice lower. You don't have to do this. For the first time since Heron had met her, Alina smiled, faint, tired but real. When I chose this work, she said, I accepted that there might be a moment when everything I gave up would finally be tested. This is that moment. There was no heroism in her tone, just ownership. Harren felt something shift inside him. In all his years of service, he had seen bravery in flashes under fire in moments of chaos. What sat across from him now was different. This was sustained courage, the kind that didn't spike, it endured. He realized then why everyone had stood straighter around her. Not because of what she could do, but because of what she had already given up, quietly, completely, without expectation of being remembered. As dawn crept closer outside the sealed walls, Harren understood something else too. This wasn't about stopping an attack. It was about whether they would ask one person to carry a burden no one else could again, and whether the world she was protecting would ever know how close it came to losing everything. How do you prepare to become someone who shouldn't survive the night? The room where the transformation began didn't look dramatic. No mirrors framed by light bulbs. No cinematic reveal. Just a sterile space, muted colors and people who spoke in low, efficient voices because everything they were about to do had been done before to others who no longer existed. Alina stood at the center of it without hesitation. Commander Harren watched from the corner, arms folded, trying not to stare. He had seen soldiers prep for raids, pilots walk toward jets knowing they might not return, medics steady themselves before mass casualties. This was different. Those people prepared to risk their lives. Alina was preparing to erase herself again. The specialists worked with quiet precision, prosthetics first, subtle changes, a nose reshaped just enough to alter recognition, cheekbones softened, fine lines added where youth had once lived, nothing exaggerated, everything believable. The goal wasn't disguise, it was plausibility. As they worked, Alina didn't speak. She didn't flinch. Her breathing remained even, controlled, like someone already operating several steps ahead of the present moment. Harren noticed something that unsettled him more than the physical changes. Her posture shifted before her face did. The straight-backed, instinctively authoritative stance he had seen at the gate softened. Her shoulders rounded slightly. Her head angled forward as if constantly listening for danger. It wasn't weakness. It was adaptation. The posture of someone who had learned that survival meant never appearing dominant unless absolutely necessary. "You don't have to watch this," one of the specialists said quietly to Harren. "I know," he replied, "but I am." Because some part of him felt this mattered. Bearing witness mattered. The voice training came next. Alina repeated phrases, names, dates. Each time the cadence shifted. An accent emerged, not strong enough to define, just enough to blur. Weariness settled into her tone, the kind that suggested years of compromise and disappointment. When she spoke again, Harren felt a strange dissonance. He recognized her eyes. He didn't recognize the person behind them. "This identity has survived because she never fully trusts anyone," Alina explained, now half in character. "She assumes betrayal as a starting point. That's how she stays alive." Harren nodded slowly. He had known people like that, people shaped entirely by the environments they endured. As the sun dipped lower outside, long shadows crept across the base. Time compressed. Final checks replaced explanations. Tiny pieces of technology were integrated into ordinary objects, a ring, a button, a strand of hair. Devices so advanced they blurred the line between body and equipment. Harren inspected each one carefully, not because he doubted the tech, because he needed something concrete to focus on. The mission briefing was short. It had to be. Primary objective, intelligence, names, timelines, confirmation. Secondary objective, survive long enough to transmit it. There was no mention of extraction, no contingency that offered comfort. As they prepared to leave, Harren finally asked the question that had been sitting in his chest since the night before. "What keeps you steady?" he said quietly. Alina paused just for a moment. not long enough to suggest uncertainty, long enough to suggest honesty. "I don't think about the end," she said. "I think about the space between decisions. If I stay present in those moments, fear doesn't get ahead of me." It wasn't an answer designed to inspire. It was practical, lived. The drive to the industrial zone passed in near silence. Alina reviewed files on a tablet, committing faces and histories to memory. Heron monitored feeds, traffic patterns, surveillance overlays. The city looked peaceful, ordinary. That terrified him more than any hostile territory ever had. The warehouse complex appeared exactly as expected, unremarkable, functional, invisible in its normalcy. Vehicles arrived one by one, following layered patterns meant to detect surveillance. Heron tracked them all, his mind cataloging habits, deviations, threats. When Alina exited the vehicle, she didn't look back. She walked toward the side entrance with the confidence of someone who belonged there, not because she felt safe, but because she had learned how to appear inevitable. Inside, the first layer of security was informal, familiar faces, subtle tests disguised as conversation. Heron listened through the audio feed as Alina navigated them effortlessly. She spoke just enough, withheld just enough. Every response carried the weight of consistency, the kind only someone who had lived the identity for years could manage. As the evening stretched on, the tension deepened. Attendees surrendered electronics, submitted to searches, questioned one another under the guise of catching up. Loyalty was measured in scars and shared failures. Alina passed each test without incident. Heron found himself holding his breath more than once, only realizing it when his chest began to ache. When the group moved deeper into the warehouse, into a secured conference space, the tone shifted. This was no longer social, it was operational. Heron heard the subtle change in Alina's voice as she activated recording systems hidden in plain sight. What followed made his blood run cold. 7 cities, specific targets, timelines measured in hours, not days. The conversations were disturbingly calm, methodical, as if they were discussing supply chains instead of mass casualties. As names surfaced, coordinators, financiers, logistics handlers, Heron watched intelligence profiles populate in real time, years of fragmented data snapping into place. This was working. And that was when the cracks began to form. Security concerns surfaced, references to recent disruptions, mentions of internal leaks. Heron heard it before he consciously recognized it, the slight tightening in Alina's responses. A shift so subtle only someone listening for it would notice. They were testing her now. Questions became more specific, dates, locations, decisions made years ago. She answered them flawlessly. But suspicion doesn't require proof, only doubt. Heron's hands hovered over authorization controls, pulse steady but elevated. Emergency extraction protocols sat one decision away. Then came the moment that changed everything. One of the cell leaders mentioned unusual military activity near a potential target, too specific, too informed. The coordinator's tone hardened. They had sources inside. Heron felt the walls close in. Alina responded without hesitation, her voice steady, her logic sound. But Heron could hear it now, the narrowing of the window. As the meeting edged toward its conclusion, Alina transmitted the final pieces of intelligence, the activation signal, the exact trigger. It was enough to stop everything. And still she stayed. The questioning intensified. Inconsistencies were suggested, not stated but implied, the most dangerous kind. Heron prepared to intervene. Before he could act, Alina made the choice herself. Her final transmission was brief, precise, complete. Then her voice softened, just slightly, not with fear but with finality. Heron understood in that moment that she had accepted something he was still fighting. She had chosen to finish the mission, even if it meant she wouldn't walk back out. The feed cut shortly after, and in the silence that followed, Heron realized the true weight of what courage looked like when stripped of spectacle. It didn't shout. It didn't rush. It stayed. What do you do when the mission succeeds? But the silence afterward feels louder than failure. The feed didn't go dead. That was the worst part. It stayed open just long enough for Heron to hear the shift in the room on the other end, the scrape of chairs, the change in breathing, the way voices lowered when suspicion stopped being theoretical. No alarms, no shouting, just the unmistakable sound of control changing hands. "Alina," a man's voice said, calm, curious, dangerous. "There's something we need to clarify." Heron's fingers hovered above the console. Extraction protocols pulsed on his screen like a warning heartbeat. One command would unleash chaos, teams breaching, lives colliding, whatever chance of containment they still had evaporating in seconds. And yet he waited, because Alina hadn't said the word. She answered the questions with measured patience. She didn't rush, didn't over-explain. Each sentence was built to withstand scrutiny, like she'd rehearsed this moment years ago without ever admitting it might come. But suspicion doesn't need mistakes, it only needs time. One of the men mentioned names Alina had never used, operational details that could only have come from leaks deep inside intelligence systems. The realization hit Heron with a sickening clarity. She wasn't being tested anymore. She was being confirmed. The voices grew closer. One moved behind her, another in front. Heron heard the faint sound of something heavy being said on metal, tools, not weapons. He exhaled slowly, jaw clenched so hard it ached. He'd sent people into danger before. He'd lost friends. But listening to it happen in real time, knowing the person on the other end was deliberately buying them minutes with her silence, that was a new kind of helplessness. "Alina," Heron said quietly into a dead channel, knowing she couldn't hear him, "you've done enough." She didn't hear him. But it wouldn't have changed anything. When the first blow landed, the sound was dull, controlled, designed not to kill, interrogation, not execution. Heron closed his eyes for half a second, just long enough to reset, then reopened them and locked back onto the feeds. He saw it all. The way she absorbed pain without letting it fracture her posture. The way she slowed her breathing, controlling her body the way divers did when oxygen ran thin. She answered when necessary, misled when possible, never gave them a clean thread to pull. And through it all she kept transmitting. Not continuously, that would have been detected. In fragments, microbursts, coordinates hidden inside innocuous phrases, timing encoded in pauses, intelligence woven into suffering so seamlessly Heron almost missed it. Almost. He routed the data instantly, watched as systems across the country ignited into motion. FBI task forces, joint counterterror units, local law enforcement suddenly handed clarity they'd never had before. New York, Washington, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Atlanta, Denver. 7 cities holding their breath without knowing why. In New York, a delivery truck was stopped 2 miles from Penn Station. In Washington, chemicals never reached the water. In Los Angeles, maintenance crews were pulled from access points they never should have been inside. It was working. Lives were being saved in real time. And Alina was still inside that warehouse. The men around her grew frustrated. The questions repeated. Anger crept in where control had once lived. That was when Heron saw the shift. Alina changed tactics. She stopped defending herself. Instead, she began to redirect them, subtly feeding them information that pointed away from active cells toward false leads, names that led to dead ends, routes that circled back on themselves. It was dangerous. If they noticed, it would end immediately. But she was no longer protecting herself. She was protecting the future. Heron recognized the moment she crossed that line. He'd seen it in soldiers who stayed behind to cover a retreat they knew they wouldn't be part of. He authorized the final phase. The strike team moved like a held breath finally released. Entry points Alina had mapped weeks, years ago opened seamlessly. Lights died. Communications collapsed. The assault lasted less than 4 minutes. 4 minutes to dismantle a network that had taken a decade to build. When Heron reached the warehouse floor, the aftermath was contained, precise, controlled. They found Alina where she'd fallen, restrained but conscious, blood at her temple, one eye swelling shut. But alive. He knelt beside her as medics moved in. She didn't look at him right away. When she finally did, there was no relief in her expression. "Did it work?" she asked. Heron swallowed hard. "Yes," he said, "everywhere." She closed her eyes then, not in exhaustion but release. The ride back was quiet. Medical equipment hummed softly. Outside the vehicle, the world continued on unaware, traffic flowing, lights blinking, people heading home without realizing how close everything had come to collapsing. At the medical facility, specialists took over. Injuries were cataloged, treated, contained, but Heron knew some wounds wouldn't show up on scans. When she woke hours later, the room was empty except for him. "They'll never know," she said quietly, staring at the ceiling. "No," Heron replied, "they won't." She nodded once, accepting, not bitter, just tired. Days passed, then weeks. Reports came in, confirmations, threat assessments downgraded. The number attached to what had been prevented grew larger with every review, thousands of lives, entire cities spared trauma they would never have language for. Heron read every line, not because he needed to, because he felt responsible to remember. Alina's recovery was slow, physical healing first, then the harder work disentangling herself from an identity that had kept her alive but couldn't sustain her anymore. She struggled with quiet, with being alone in rooms where no one was watching her, with mirrors. Heron visited when he could. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. One afternoon, he found her standing at the window, watching recruits drill in the distance. "They stand straighter around you," he said. She almost smiled. "They always have," she replied. "They just never know why." Heron finally understood something that had taken him an entire career to learn. Some people serve so deeply that the world can't afford to know their names. And some victories are so complete they leave no trace, except in the silence that follows. That silence, Heron realized, was the sound of a future still intact. And it existed because one woman had chosen to stay when leaving would have been easier. What happens when the danger is gone, but the person who carried it doesn't know who they are without it? Recovery didn't arrive like relief. It arrived like confusion. Alina woke up one morning and realized no one was watching her. No handlers behind glass. No enemy across the table. No voice in her ear measuring her breathing or her words. Just a quiet room, soft light, and a body that ached in ways she could finally feel. That terrified her more than the warehouse ever had. For years, every hour of her life had been accounted for. Purpose had been constant, sharp, immediate. Now time stretched, empty, unassigned. The absence of threat left too much space for memory. Commander Heron noticed it during his visits. She answered questions politely, professionally, but something was missing. The precision was still there. The calm. What wasn't there was direction. "You don't have another assignment," he told her one afternoon, choosing the words carefully. "Not yet." She nodded, eyes on the window. "I know." It wasn't disappointment in her voice. It was disorientation. Doctors spoke about recovery in phases, physical first, then psychological, They explained deep cover fatigue, identity diffusion, the cost of sustained vigilance. Heron listened, but he understood something the charts couldn't show. Alina didn't just lose an identity. She had never been allowed to keep one. When she walked through the facility, people reacted the same way they always had. Subtle shifts, straighter backs, quieter voices. No one asked questions. No one needed explanations. Those who knew, knew. Those who didn't still sensed something real. It wasn't reverence. It was recognition. A senior SEAL once paused mid-conversation when she passed and waited until she was gone before continuing. A young lieutenant stopped himself from complaining about training the moment he saw her and stood there, embarrassed, unsure why. Alina noticed, she always noticed, and it made her uneasy. "I don't want to be this," she said one evening when Heron found her sitting alone in the common room. "Whatever they think I am." "What do you want to be?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. "I don't know," she said finally. "I've never been allowed to ask that." That admission hit Heron harder than any after-action report ever had. Weeks passed, clearance reviews, psychological evaluations, closed-door meetings that resulted in nods and sealed folders. The system didn't quite know what to do with someone like her once the emergency was over. Medals were discussed, dismissed, public acknowledgement considered and immediately rejected. Her safety and the safety of others depended on silence. Instead, there was a private room, no cameras, no records. A handful of people entered one by one, men and women whose decisions shaped entire regions of the world. They didn't give speeches. They didn't shake hands for photographs. They simply said thank you. Not the ceremonial kind, the real kind, the kind spoken by people who understood exactly what it cost. Alina accepted it quietly. Later, she told Heron it felt strange. "Gratitude is loud," she said. "It doesn't match the work." The harder part came afterward, when the doors closed and the world resumed pretending nothing had happened. She struggled with sleep. Not nightmares, those were familiar, but mornings. The question of what came next pressed heavier than fear ever had. Heron arranged for her to spend time on base unofficially. No role, no command, just presence. She watched training exercises, sat in on briefings she didn't contribute to, walked the perimeter in the early mornings when the air was still cool and the base hadn't fully woken yet. It helped. Slowly, she began to reconnect with her own thoughts, without filtering them through survival. One morning, she asked Heron something unexpected. "Do you ever regret knowing too much?" she asked. He considered it. "Sometimes, but I regret not knowing more." She nodded. "I regret forgetting who I was before any of this." He didn't tell her the truth he suspected. That the person she was before no longer existed, not because it had been taken, but because she had outgrown it. The reports kept coming. Follow-on operations, arrests overseas linked back to the intelligence she had gathered years earlier, networks collapsing like old scaffolding once the central supports were removed. Each update confirmed what Heron already knew. Her impact hadn't ended with the warehouse. It was still unfolding. Yet none of it gave her peace. That came from something smaller. One afternoon, a young analyst approached her hesitantly in the corridor. No rank displayed, no formal introduction. "Ma'am," she said, then stopped, unsure. "I just wanted to say I didn't know women could do what you did, not like that." Alina studied her for a moment. "Most people don't," she replied gently. "That's kind of the point." The analyst smiled, not in awe but relief. Afterward, Alina was quiet for a long time. "That mattered," she said finally. Heron understood. It wasn't about recognition. It was about meaning. As months passed, the sharp edges softened. Alina learned how to sit with stillness without scanning every corner, how to speak without measuring each word as potential cover, how to let silence exist without filling it. She began training again, not for missions but for herself, running at dawn, strength work, familiar routines that reminded her she still had control over her own body. One evening, she stopped Harren as he was leaving. "If they ask again," she said, "I'll go." He nodded. He had never doubted that. "But," she added, "I don't want to disappear completely next time." That was new. Hope, he realized, didn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrived as a condition. The system would figure it out. It always did. What mattered was that Elena had finally allowed herself to imagine a future that wasn't defined solely by erasure. She still carried the weight of what she had done, always would. But now it wasn't crushing her. It was grounding her. And for the first time since Harren had met her standing alone in the rain without an identity, Elena wasn't just surviving between missions. She was beginning carefully, quietly to live. When the world finally moves on, what remains of the one who held it together? Time passed in a way Elena wasn't used to, not measured in operations or countdowns or windows closing, just days, ordinary ones, the kind she had once protected without ever imagining she might live inside them again. Morning light became something she noticed instead of avoided. The sound of training drills no longer triggered reflexive calculations. She could sit with her back to a door now, not always comfortably, but willingly. Commander Harren saw the change before she did. It wasn't dramatic. It was in the way she paused to watch recruits laugh between sets, in how she corrected someone's stance without taking over, in how she listened more than she spoke. She was no longer waiting for the next emergency. That didn't mean she was finished. The final evaluation came quietly. No summons, no ceremony, just a walk down a familiar corridor into a room that held no insignia, no flags, only people whose authority didn't require decoration. They spoke to her plainly. The world would never know her name. The operations would remain classified. The danger tied to her past identities hadn't vanished. It had only faded enough to manage. But there was a choice now. She could remain in the shadows, advise, train, shape missions without stepping back into the role that had consumed her. Or if she chose, she could disappear again. No pressure, no expectations. For the first time in her career, the decision was hers. Elena asked one question. "If I stay," she said, "can I still matter?" One of them answered without hesitation. "You already do." She thought about the warehouse, the silence afterward, the lives that kept unfolding because she had endured what no one would ever thank her for publicly. She thought about the young analyst in the hallway, about the recruits who stood straighter without knowing why. "I'll stay," she said. Not because she was afraid to go back out, but because she had finally learned the value of being present. Months later, the base changed commanders. New faces arrived, old ones rotated out, stories shifted, but something remained. Whenever Elena entered a room, conversation softened, postures adjusted, not out of fear, out of recognition. She never corrected it. She never explained it. She didn't need to. Harren wrote his final report late one evening, long after most of the base had gone quiet. He chose his words carefully, knowing few would ever read them and fewer still would understand. He didn't write about bravery or sacrifice or heroism. He wrote about restraint, about choosing silence when noise would have been easier, about holding the line long enough for others to never know it existed. He ended with a sentence that felt truer than anything else he could offer. "Some people don't carry flags. They carry futures." Elena never read the report. She didn't need to. Her proof lived in the ordinary, in crowded stations that stayed crowded, in schools that rang bells instead of sirens, in cities that slept through nights they never knew were once threatened. She walked the perimeter at dawn sometimes, hands in her pockets, breathing in air that no longer tasted like urgency. She still carried scars, always would, but they no longer defined her. Because identity, she had learned, wasn't something written down or erased. It was something revealed by what you chose to protect, even when no one was watching. And sometimes, the strongest people aren't remembered by name. They're remembered by the quiet continuity of the world they refuse to let fall apart. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.